Welcome. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share and subscribe. For a bit of fun, comment where you're from and what time you're watching this video. Now lie back, relax and let sleep consume you. Night fell quickly by the river. We put up the tent near the trees, thinking it a nice quiet place for the weekend. The river moved swiftly beside us, the sound mostly peaceful. Later, when it became truly dark, different sounds came from the woods. A cry traveled through the trees. It was a long, high sound. We were inside the tent by then, ready to sleep. We stopped talking to listen. The cry came again, further away maybe, but clear. Someone in trouble possibly. Or just people having fun in the woods, we considered. We zipped the tent shut and tried to ignore it. Time passed. The woods settled into quiet. Just the river sound now. Then it came again. Another cry, this time different, shorter, sharper. Like a shout of pain. It was not far off. Definitely not fun. We looked at each other in the dim light of the tent. What was that? We stayed quiet, listening hard into the darkness. No more sounds from the trees then, only the river flowing onward. We tried to sleep, but it was not easy. Every small snap of a branch outside made us jump a little. Morning came grey and damp. We unzipped the tent and exited into the open air. The woods looked normal in the daylight, just trees and bushes. Birds called. The river still rushed. We walked around the tent to stretch our legs and have a look at the area in the light. Then we noticed them. Footprints in the soft earth around our tent. Big prints, shoe prints, human prints. They went all the way around the outside of the tent. A circle of prints, as if someone had walked around and around us during the night. Walked right around our sleeping tent. We looked at each other, a strange feeling building up inside. It was not a nice feeling. We checked the prints carefully. Only one set of prints. Someone had circled us. Last night's cries, then these prints. It did not add up to anything good. We ate breakfast quickly, not saying much. The woods did not seem so peaceful now in the daylight. The birds sounded loud and sharp. Every rustle in the leaves made us turn our heads. The day passed slowly. We tried to relax, sitting by the river reading. But the feeling from the morning stayed. We kept looking back at the woods. Were we being watched? It felt like it. The trees seemed darker, deeper in the daytime now. As dusk approached, the feeling became stronger. We made a small fire and sat by it as darkness arrived again. The woods turned black around the edge of the firelight. Every shadow seemed to move. The sounds of the night started, insects buzzing, small animals moving in the leaves, normal night noises. But we were not relaxed. We remembered the cries, the footprints. We sat close to the fire, feeling very alone. Later, when the fire had burned low, we went back into the tent. It felt safer inside, even if it was only thin fabric between us and the dark woods. We lay down, zipped the tent, and switched off the torch. Total blackness. The river sound was still there, constant. Then another sound, very near to the tent, breathing. Someone was breathing just outside. We froze, holding our own breath, listening to the breathing outside. It was close to the side of the tent, right by our heads. We could hear each breath clearly, in and out, in and out. We stayed completely still, not making a sound. The breathing continued. It was definitely outside the tent, very close, not animal breathing, human breathing. Someone was right there next to us in the dark, breathing by our tent. A fear went through me, cold and sharp. What was out there? Why were they breathing by our tent? Very slowly, I reached for the torch beside me. My hand shook. I switched it on and pointed it at the tent wall beside my head where the breathing was. Nothing. Just green tent fabric in the torchlight. The breathing stopped. Total silence apart from the river. We held the torch beam steady on the tent wall, waiting. Nothing moved. No sound. Had it gone? Had it been our imagination? But we both heard it. The breathing, so close. Carefully, I unzipped the tent side a little way, just enough to peek out with the torch, sweeping the beam around outside. Trees, bushes, ground, nothing, no one there, just empty darkness at the edge of the torchlight. The breathing was gone completely. We looked at each other in the torch beam. What was happening? I zipped the tent completely shut again. We sat up in the dark, backs against the tent wall, listening. Every tiny sound from outside seemed huge now. Every rustle, every snap, every drip of water. We stayed like that for a long time, not moving, listening. Eventually we must have drifted into a light sleep, exhaustion taking over. I don't know how long we slept, but I woke suddenly to a cold rush of air. Something was different. I sat up quickly, heart racing. The tent felt colder. Then I noticed it, a long tear in the tent fabric right beside my head. A cut, from outside going in, long and jagged, wide open to the night air. Moonlight now shone into the tent through the rip. We had slept with the tent cut open beside our heads. We scrambled out of the tent as soon as it was light. Everything felt urgent now. We had to get away. We packed up fast, throwing everything into bags, not caring if it was tidy. The woods looked the same in the early light, but everything felt different. Danger was in the air. We could feel it. We dragged everything to the car park, wanting only to get in the car and drive away from this place. Then we saw it, the car. Standing there in the grey morning light, something was definitely not right. We got closer. Flat tires. All 4 tires were flat. Slash marks in the rubber, cut open, just like the tent. We looked around wildly, the woods surrounding the car park. No one, just trees and silence and the flat tires of our car. Stranded. Woods pressed around us, trees so tall they blocked out most of the sky. We pushed through bushes, branches catching at our clothes. We were going somewhere new, somewhere none of us had been before. A path appeared, thin and overgrown, leading deeper into the trees. We followed it. The path twisted and turned, going downwards. A smell came to us then, damp earth and something else, something metallic. The trees opened up a little and we were in a small clearing. In the middle stood a cabin, old wood, grey and rotting in places. The windows were dark. It did not look inviting. We went closer anyway. The door hung slightly open, creaking a little in the breeze. One of us pushed it wider and we went inside. The air inside was cold, even colder than outside. It smelled musty, old wood and dust. Our eyes adjusted to the dim light. The room was just one big space. A fireplace made of stones was on one wall. There was a rough wooden table in the center of the room and some stools around it. In the corner, a pile of blankets lay folded. Then we looked up. From the beams in the ceiling hung things, big metal hooks, rusted orange-brown. They looked strong, like they could hold something very big. We stared at them, not saying anything. What were they for? We looked down. The wooden floor was dark in patches, darker than the rest of the wood. It was stained, a deep brown black. It was all around the base of the hooks. A shiver went down my back. I did not like this place anymore. A sound from outside. Footsteps crunching on leaves and twigs not far away. Getting nearer, we froze. Who was coming? This cabin felt empty, abandoned. We moved quickly. We got behind the table, crouching down, trying to be quiet. The footsteps were louder now, right outside the cabin. The door started to open further, push from the outside. A huge shape filled the doorway. Taller than any man I had ever seen. Broad shoulders, a big head. It stepped inside. I could only see its back. It was wearing dark clothes, rough material. It dragged something behind it into the cabin. A long, shapeless thing that bumped along the floor. The shape turned around. Not a man, something else. Its face was hidden in shadow under a deep hood. I could see hands, though, massive hands with thick fingers. One of the hands held something metal, long and thin. It went to the fireplace. It knelt down, putting the long metal thing on the hearth stones. It picked up another piece of metal, smaller, with a handle. It began to rub the smaller metal against the long one. A scraping, grating sound filled the cabin, sharpening. It was sharpening a blade. The sound was awful, scraping on and on. The shape's breathing was loud in the small room, deep whooshing sounds. I could smell something now, strong and animal, coming from it. It stopped sharpening. It stood up, turning towards the hooks. It reached up, touching one of them, testing the point of the blade with its thumb. The shape moved to the thing it had dragged in. It began to pull at it, hoisting it up towards the hooks. We had to get out, now. I nodded to my friends. We would go for the door. It was the only way. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. We burst from behind the table, scrambling towards the door. The shape turned. I glimpsed its face then, just for a second. Pale skin, dark eyes that seemed to glow. It made a noise, a roar, not words. It dropped what it was holding. We were at the door, pushing it open, running out. The shape was right behind us. I could hear it crashing through the cabin, heavy feet pounding on the wooden floor. We ran into the trees, branches whipping at our faces. We didn't look back. We just ran, faster than we had ever run before. We ran and ran until we could not run anymore, lungs burning, legs aching. We stopped, leaning against trees, gasping for air. We listened, silence, and only the sound of wind in the leaves. Had it stopped chasing us? We did not know. We didn't dare go back to check. We kept going, away from the cabin, away from that place. We walked for hours until we reached the edge of the woods and then the road. We walked back to town, never speaking about what we had experienced. We just wanted to forget. Days later, the police went to the woods. Someone had reported us missing when we did not return home. They found the cabin. It was empty. No sign of the shape, no sign of anyone. Just the cabin, silent and still. And the hooks hanging from the ceiling. Clean now. Shiny metal in the dim light, waiting. Joining the forum had seemed a good idea. A camping trip in the mountains, perfect. I met the others at the trailhead. Smiles, backpacks, excited chatter. We hiked for hours, sunlight warming our backs, reaching the designated spot as dusk arrived. Tents went up quickly. We arranged ourselves in a small circle amongst the trees. The night sounds began, rustling leaves, distant calls of birds settling for sleep. Safe, I assumed. Morning fractured through the canvas. I unzipped the tent flap, expecting to see the others already moving. Silence, unusual. Then I noticed an empty space where a tent had been, Liam's tent, gone, and then I noticed it, a jagged rip, tearing through the fabric of the tent next to where Liam's had stood. A long, violent slash. Panic rippled through the remaining group. "Animal," someone whispered, voice strained. "A wild cat, maybe." We searched the immediate area, calling Liam's name. Nothing, just trees, rocks, the growing morning light. No sign, no trace. We examined the ground around where his tent had been. Nothing disturbed, no footprints except our own from the previous day. It made no sense, but the slashed tent was real. An animal attack, we decided, trying to convince ourselves. Scared, but resolving to be sensible, we packed up Liam's remaining things. We had to keep moving. Staying put felt worse. The hike that day was different. The easy camaraderie of the day before was gone. Each shadow seemed deeper, each snap of a twig sharper. We stayed close together, eyes scanning the trees. We reached the next campsite in the late afternoon, a small clearing near a stream. Setting up camp was a quiet process this time. The air was still, heavy with unspoken worry. As darkness deepened again, the forest sounds seemed amplified, pressing in on us. I tried to sleep, but every rustle outside the tent made my heart race. Dawn came, grey and muted through the tent fabric. I got up, stiff and unrested, and unzipped the entrance again. Another empty space. Sarah's tent, gone, no rip this time, just vanished. Like it had never been there. The blood drained from my face. Not an animal. Not Liam, then either. We were missing another person. Sarah's name echoed through the trees unanswered. We searched again, wider this time. Everywhere around the clearing, through the undergrowth, calling, desperate. Nothing, just the forest, indifferent. And then we checked the ground again, around where Sarah's tent had been. Dust, leaves, our own footprints from setting up camp. Nothing else, no footprints leading away. Impossible. She couldn't just disappear, but she had. We stared at each other, fear now raw, sharp. We had to get out, now. We packed everything, movements fast, frantic, leaving the tents this time. Too exposed, we walked, almost ran, back along the trail. Each rustle behind a tree felt like something following. Every shadow seemed to move. We didn't stop until exhaustion forced us to. Huddled together beside the path, we tried to decide what to do. Go back? Keep going? Neither option felt safe. We had to keep moving towards help, towards other people. We started walking again, faster this time, not speaking, just the sound of our boots on the trail, our ragged breaths. We found a wider clearing as night arrived again. No choice but to stop. No energy left to go further in the dark. We huddled together in the open, no tents, just sleeping bags pulled tight. Every nerve end screamed. The night sounds were a torment. Each creak, each snap sounded like footsteps. Sleep was impossible. Just lying there, staring into the darkness, listening, waiting for dawn, waiting for something else. Morning light. I opened my eyes, relief flooding through me. We had made it through the night. Then I turned my head. Mark's sleeping bag was empty, just a depression in the leaves where he'd been. He was gone too, vanished in the open clearing. No tent, no cover, just gone. The ground around the sleeping bag undisturbed. Our breaths caught in our throats. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. 3 people, gone, without a trace, without a sound, without footprints, just me and Ben left. We stared at each other, faces pale, eyes wide. We had to get away. Now! We started running, not walking, running, pounding down the trail, branches whipping at our faces, lungs burning. We ran and ran, not stopping, not looking back. until we could run no more, collapsing by the side of the trail, gasping for air. We had to keep moving, but our legs wouldn't work. We sat there, backs against trees, listening, waiting, dread filling every space inside us. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. We hadn't spoken. Words were useless. Just the rustling of leaves, the distant bird calls, the sound of our breathing, and something else. A different sound, faint at first, then growing, footsteps coming towards us on the trail. Relief surged through me. Help, finally, police, rangers, someone. The footsteps grew louder, closer. We stood up, shaky legs supporting us, ready to see someone, anyone. Ben was beside me, then he wasn't. And one moment there, the next moment gone, just empty space where he stood. I spun around, heart seizing. No sound, no movement, just the trees and the approaching footsteps. Closer now. Very close. I was alone, completely alone. The footsteps stopped just beyond the trees. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, waiting. Then voices, not shouts of alarm, not calls for help, just voices, normal voices, talking calmly, police voices. They stepped into the clearing, faces grim, looking not at the trees, not around, looking straight at me. "We need you to come with us," one of them said, voice flat. "There are some questions we need to ask you." They moved closer, and I saw their faces, not grim, not flat, suspicious, accusing, and something else in their eyes, something cold, knowing. They think I did it. They think I made them disappear. But I didn't. I swear I didn't. But who will believe me? Night had dropped its curtain around us in the forest. A fire crackled, spitting sparks that flew upwards to vanish in the dark trees above. We sat close to the flames, their orange glow pushing back the edges of the blackness. Stories were passed around, the sort told when you are far from homes and the normal world. Tales of things unseen, of places not quite right, of figures that moved when you were not looking. As someone spoke of a house in his village, supposed to be empty, but sometimes showing a light in an upstairs window. I glanced about. My eyes scanned the ring of people warmed by the fire, then drifted to the trees beyond. Something flickered at the edge of my sight, just past the person opposite me. For a moment a shape seemed to detach itself from the darkness behind him, like a puff of smoke. It was there, then gone. I blinked, thinking it must have been a trick of the firelight and dancing heat. The storyteller continued, his voice dropping to a whisper as he reached the scary part. A few minutes later it happened again. This time it was behind someone to my left, a darker patch in the darkness. A brief distortion that shifted and then was simply not there. It was quick, almost too quick to register. I turned my head fully, staring directly at the spot, but there was nothing, just the solid black trunks of trees and the deeper black beyond. I shifted in my seat, a little jolt running through me that was not from the stories. More tales continued, each wrapped in a growing silence as the night deepened. Everyone was looking into the fire now, faces lit from below, eyes reflecting the dancing flames. I looked around the circle once more, and there it was, behind the person to my right. Clearer now and lasting a fraction longer, it looked almost like a person's shape, stretched and thin, made of pure dark. It wavered for a split second, then dissolved back into the night. A cold sensation spread in my chest. This was not firelight playing tricks, this was something else. I wanted to say something, to point it out, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? "Did you see that dark patch behind you that wasn't really there?" It sounded foolish, even to me. And what if no one else could perceive it? I watched more intently now, my eyes darting around the circle, checking behind each person in turn. The storytelling had stopped, replaced by a silence filled only with the crackle of the fire and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The air felt different, colder maybe, despite the fire's heat. The dark shape reappeared, and again, each time it was behind a different person, flickering into existence, hanging there for a breath, then vanishing as if swallowed by the night. With each appearance it seemed to gain a little substance, to be a little less fleeting. It was no longer just a trick of the light, it was becoming definite. Panic tightened in my stomach. I glanced at the others. Were they seeing it too? They stared into the fire, their faces still and shadowed. No one moved, no one spoke, but something in their stillness felt different now. Not just absorption in the stories, but something else. Something held. The fire began to change. Its bright flames lessened, sinking lower and lower. The cheerful crackling faded to soft pops and hisses. The orange glow retreated, pulling back and back, letting the darkness creep inwards. The edges of our little circle were swallowed first, then the shadows deepened around our feet, then crept higher. Faster than it should have, the fire died. One moment there were embers glowing red, the next moment there was nothing, just blackness, complete utter blackness. No starlight, no moon, just thick, heavy dark pressing in from all sides. The forest sounds, the rustling leaves, even the soft breeze seemed to stop. There was only silence, a deep, profound silence that settled over everything. Then in the silence I could perceive voices, quiet voices, murmuring just at the edge of my hearing. Whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I strained my ears, trying to understand what they were saying, but the words were indistinct, just a low susurrus of sound. And then I realized something that sent ice through my veins. The voices, they were familiar, terribly familiar. They were our voices, my voice, the voice of the person next to me, the voices of everyone who had been sitting around the fire. But no one was speaking. We were all still, frozen in the darkness, absolutely silent. Yet the whispers continued, our own voices murmuring in the blackness all around us. The whispering intensified, rising slightly in volume, becoming clearer yet still indistinct in meaning. It was like hearing echoes of conversations that had never happened, fragments of thoughts spoken aloud but unheard. The sound filled the darkness, pressing against my ears, wrapping around my mind. A strange sensation began to develop. It was as if the darkness itself was becoming aware. As if the blackness was not just an absence of light, but something active, something present. The whispers seemed to emanate from it, to be part of it, to be the voice of the dark itself. Then, just as suddenly as it had died, the fire burst back to life. Flames erupted upwards, bright and fierce, pushing back the dark with violent suddenness. The crackling returned, loud and sharp, filling the silence that had gone before. The orange glow flooded outwards, illuminating the circle, chasing away the black. I blinked in the sudden light, my eyes struggling to adjust, and then I looked around. The fire burned strongly, but the circle was broken. Empty spaces gaped between the remaining people. I counted quickly. 1, 2, 3, 4. There were only 4 of us left. Where moments before there had been more, now there were empty spaces. As if people had simply stood up and walked away, but no one had moved. I would have noticed. I had been watching. Disbelief and rising terror choked me. I looked wildly at the others. Their faces were pale, eyes wide and staring, reflecting the firelight like frightened animals. They were looking at the empty spaces too. They perceived it. They knew. We sat there, the 4 of us, in the circle of firelight, surrounded by empty spaces and the silent, watchful forest. No one moved. No one spoke. The fire crackled and spat, sending sparks upwards into the dark trees. But the stories were gone. The night was different now. Days later, search teams arrived. They combed the forest, calling out names, searching through the trees, pushing through the undergrowth. They found the remains of the campfire, the circle of scorched earth, the dropped blanket we had used as a seat, but they found nothing else, no trace of the missing people, no sign of what had taken them. The forest held its silence, keeping its secrets locked within the darkness beyond the firelight. The day had started with clear skies as I set out on my hike, but the weather quickly changed. A thick fog rolled in without warning, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. I paused, my heart racing as I looked for a familiar landmark, but everything started to blend together in the mist. Each step felt uncertain, and the path seemed to disappear beneath my feet. I trudged on, anxiety building with every passing moment. The chilling dampness soaked through my clothes, and I shivered. Just when I thought the fog would swallow me whole, a figure emerged. An old man stood between the trees, his silhouette sharp against the fog's gloom. He raised a hand, indicating for me to follow him. Perhaps he knew a way out, or had better sense of direction. With little choice, I moved towards him, leaving the fading echo of my own footsteps behind. The old man led the way through the dense pack of trees. I struggled to keep my pace, each movement feeling like a battle against the cold and exhaustion. Time seemed to twist and stretch as we walked deeper into the misty embrace of the forest. I kept my eyes locked on him, hoping he would lead me to safety. Hours passed and the surroundings began to blur further. The trees lost their shapes, becoming mere shadows in the fog, and yet the old man never faltered. I tried to ask where we were heading, but the words caught in my throat. I could not give voice to the fear creeping up inside me. Then the ground beneath my feet sloped downward sharply. Suddenly the fog lifted just enough for me to see the edge of something dark, an enormous ravine. I skidded to a halt, heart pounding, just inches from the precipice. Had I taken one more step, I would have fallen into oblivion. Panic surged within me. Where had the old man gone? I turned frantically, searching. The eerie stillness engulfed me, but the man had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The trees loomed closely, resembling monstrous figures blocking my escape. I stepped back from the chasm, breathless and disoriented, desperate to find a way back to where I'd entered the fog. After an excruciatingly long climb, I stumbled upon a ranger station. It was small, squat, with peeling paint, but there was comfort in its presence. I pushed the door open, almost collapsing inside. The ranger looked up from his desk, eyes wide with surprise. I hurried to explain, breathless and panicked. I described the old man, how he had appeared out of the fog, and gestured for me to follow him deeper into the woods. But the ranger's expression shifted from surprise to concern. He leaned forward, his face ashen. That old man, he died years ago. Leading a hiker just like you, lost in the same fog. Chills rushed through me like icy water. My mind raced to process what I had just heard. The old man was dead, lost like the countless others before me. They found his body at the bottom of that ravine, the tale told in hushed tones by rangers and hikers alike. Something strangled at my heart. I had followed a ghost, a wraith guiding me deeper into danger. As my thoughts spiraled, the fog's weight returned, pressing against my mind. The truth clawed at me, squeezing the air from my lungs. There were tales about the wayward fog in these woods. Some said it led you astray, tempting you with spectres meant to lure. As I looked back at the ranger, his gaze no longer held surprise, but instead a grim acceptance. Perhaps I was not the first to be fooled. The thought of what almost happened to me pressed hard against my mind. The idea spun like a fragile thread, ready to snap. Had I truly escaped? Or was I still caught in some sick game played by the lost spirits of this forest? I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to run, yet my feet hesitated. Another chill washed over me, not from the cold, but from the realization that I might not be alone anymore. I stepped outside the fog, closing back in around me. How could something feel both familiar and terrifying? The path home seemed impossible to find. Memories of the old man returned. I thought I had escaped, but in the thrall of that fog was I still being watched, still being led by those who spoke not a word. Behind me, an echo of footsteps faintly brushed against the ground. I turned to see the ranger, his face pale, framed by the darkened doorway. He merely stared, his eyes wide with understanding as the fog deepened around me, wrapping tightly in an unending embrace. And as the mist swirled like restless phantoms, I now knew the truth was not always clear. With each step I took forward, something in the depths of that forest beckoned me back into the shadows, and I was no longer certain of which way was home. The path vanished without warning. One moment it was there, winding through the trees, the next gone. Just leaves and tangled roots. I checked my map, then my compass. Nothing made sense. I should have been miles away from that place. It had been 3 days since I ventured deep into the woods, a place I hadn't been before. Sunlight barely touched the forest floor, and the trees grew so close together it felt like walking through a tunnel. Then I found it, a clearing, small and still. In the center, an old campsite. Chairs arranged neatly around a circle of blackened earth. Backpacks covered in green moss leaned against logs. A metal pot hung above the fire pit. Everything looked stagnant, as if time itself had forgotten this little patch of woodland. But it wasn't the age of the site that disturbed me. It was the stillness, no rot, no decay. The fabric of the backpacks wasn't torn, the metal of the pot wasn't rusted. It was as if the occupants had simply vanished, leaving everything in place. I pulled out my camera, a sense of morbid curiosity taking hold, snapped a few pictures of the scene, focusing on the arrangement of the chairs, the way the moss clung to the abandoned packs. I wanted to remember this, to try and understand it. Then a growing sense of discomfort pushed me onward. I needed to leave. Back on the trail, I tried to rationalize what I had found. Hikers who had vanished, a prank gone wrong, the woods played tricks on your mind. That evening, back at my lodgings, I decided to look at the photos. I plugged my camera into my laptop, transferred the images, and opened the folder. The first few were as I remembered: the clearing, the chairs, the pot. Then came the photo of the backpacks. Except something was different. In the picture there were figures sitting in the chairs. People. They were facing the camera, their faces pale and indistinct, yet undeniably present. A wave of cold washed over me. I zoomed in, my fingers shaking. They were there, staring. I deleted the photo instantly, heart pounding. A glitch, I reasoned. A trick of the light, a fault in the camera. It had to be. I scrolled through the other pictures. The figures were in all of them, always facing the camera. Sleep offered little escape. Images flashed behind my eyelids. The faces in the clearing, the stagnant campsite. The next morning I decided to cut my trip short. The unease was too much. I packed my bag, checked my GPS and set off. The device initially showed the correct route, guiding me along the familiar paths. But after a few hours the screen flickered and died. I tried restarting it, but nothing happened, just a blank screen. Annoyed but not panicked, I pulled out my map and compass. But the compass spun wildly, refusing to settle on a direction. The map seemed to show distortions of the terrain that simply couldn't be real. I was lost. I walked for what seemed like hours, the trees beginning to look the same, the leaves crunching under my boots. The sun began to dip, its beams struggling to penetrate the canopy. Then through the trees, a familiar shape, a small, still clearing, the campsite. It was exactly as I had left it, the chairs, the backpacks, the pot. Everything still and stagnant, except the chairs were no longer empty. Figures sat around the dead fire pit, pale faces turned towards me. My partner and I, lost in the sprawling national forest, followed a barely there path, hoping for a sign, any sign of civilization. Dusk painted the woods in shades of grey and deeper grey, and a creeping dread gnawed at my insides. Emerging into a small clearing, we stopped. A fire, still burning, embers glowed warmly in a makeshift pit ringed by stones. Abandoned. Relief washed over us, followed swiftly by a prickling discomfort. Why would anyone leave a fire burning? We huddled near the warmth, the dancing flames chasing away some of the encroaching chill. Exhaustion settled in. We decided to risk it to rest until morning. We spread our sleeping bags a safe distance from the fire, the silence of the woods pressing in around us. As darkness deepened, a sound. Footfalls circling. Just beyond the firelight's reach, something moved amongst the trees. I nudged my partner, fear a cold knot in my stomach. We both listened, frozen, as the unseen presence continued its rounds. Around and around it went, the snapping of twigs and rustling of leaves the only evidence of its existence. Hours crawled past. The fire dimmed, casting long, distorted shapes that danced with every flicker. The circling continued, a constant, unnerving reminder that we were not alone. Sleep was impossible. We lay rigid, listening until the faintest hint of light bled into the sky. Dawn broke, painting the trees in soft hues of grey and green. The circling had stopped some time before. We scrambled to our feet, eager to leave the clearing. That's when we noticed our packs open, our meagre food supplies gone. Scattered amongst our belongings were unfamiliar items, strange, carved wooden trinkets and bundles of dried herbs. We hurried back to the ranger station, desperate to report what we'd experienced. The ranger listened, his face growing pale. He consulted a map, his finger tracing a route to the area we described. He looked up, his eyes filled with something akin to horror. He said that particular section of the forest had been closed off for years. A tragedy, he explained. A group of campers vanished without a trace. Their bodies were never recovered. No one had been allowed to camp there since. The laughter jolted me awake. A giggle, childish and high-pitched, cut through the quiet of the woods. My mate stirred beside me, grumbling, but I was already straining to listen. It came again, bubbling with a dark joy that set my teeth on edge. I nudged my mate harder, pointing to the tent flap. Carefully I unzipped it, peering out into the night. The embers of our campfire sputtered, offering weak light. Just beyond the reach of the light, something crouched. It was vaguely human in shape, but twisted. Its back was hunched, limbs too long, like a broken puppet. But it was the face that froze my blood. It was grinning, not a friendly smile, but a vast, impossible stretch of skin pulled back to reveal too many teeth. The grin was fixed, unwavering. It just stayed there, grinning in the gloom. The laughter, previously sporadic, became constant. a gurgling stream of amusement directed at us. I pushed my mate, pointing. He gasped, scrambling back. We both held our breath, paralyzed by the sight. The thing didn't move a muscle, its grin the only sign of life. As the fire faded, the laughter changed. The quality shifted, becoming deeper, raspier. The grin seemed to widen, if that were even possible. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was locked in place, a prisoner of that awful smile. Then silence. The fire was reduced to glowing ash, and the thing was gone. Morning arrived, cold and grey. I pushed the tent flap open, dread pooling in my stomach. The campsite was deserted, but something was very badly different. All around the tent, gouges marked the earth, deep furrows, as if some enormous beast had raked its claws across the ground. The marks started right at the edge of the tent and went straight into the forest. I traced one with my finger. They were deep, very deep. Something with immense strength had made them. My mate came out of the tent, his face pale. He saw the marks, his eyes widening in horror. We looked at each other, fear cementing our bond. We packed in silence, every rustle of leaves sounding like approaching footsteps, every snap of a twig an impending doom. We hurried through the trees, not daring to look back. The image of that grin burned into my mind. We walked for what felt like ages, the claw marks always in view. Deeper and deeper into the woods, we wandered. We needed to keep moving, but we were lost now. Hours later, we came across a road. We did what anyone would do and headed home. That night, however, I was once again awoken by a sound, a familiar sound. Rain lashed against my face, blinding me. The wind howled, tearing at my clothes as I stumbled through the woods, my friend Mark just behind. We'd been fools to think a hike in late autumn was a good idea. The storm had come on so quickly, swallowing us whole. Then, through the trees, a shape emerged. A cabin, or rather the skeleton of one. Just walls, a roof half finished, but enough to offer some escape from the fury of the storm. We scrambled inside, shaking the water from our coats. The place was musty, filled with the scent of damp wood and something else, something indefinable. Dust lay everywhere, coating the floor, the walls, the few tools scattered about. An axe leaned against a wall, a saw lay on a workbench half-eaten by rust. It was as if the builders had simply vanished, tools in hand, leaving everything behind. We settled in as best we could, finding a relatively dry spot in a corner. The storm raged outside, the wind whistling through the gaps in the walls. It was cold, and the light was fading fast. As darkness grew, the sounds of the forest changed. The wind still roared, but beneath it other noises emerged, rustlings and creaks. A branch scraped against the cabin wall, making me jump. Mark shifted beside me, equally on edge. We huddled together, trying to ignore the growing sense of discomfort. The air seemed to grow cold. Then it came. A sound, piercing the storm. A high-pitched shriek that made my blood run cold. Not an animal sound, not anything I recognized. It was filled with pain, with terror. It echoed through the woods and then faded. We froze, listening. The storm seemed to hush for a moment, as if holding its breath. The silence was worse than the wind, the rain. It was heavy, full of anticipation. Then came the footsteps, not the light, scampering footsteps of a rabbit or a squirrel. These were heavy, measured, and coming our way. They crunched on fallen leaves, snapped twigs. Whatever was making them was big, and it was getting nearer. My heart hammered against my ribs. I could feel Mark trembling beside me. We were trapped, cornered in this half-built cage. The footsteps grew, the sound filling the small space. They circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. I could almost feel whatever it was peering in through the gaps in the walls. A twig snapped right outside the entrance. I held my breath, every muscle tense. Then the footsteps moved away, fading into the storm. We waited, not daring to breathe for what felt like an eternity. The storm picked up again, the wind howling, the rain lashing against the cabin. Eventually, when we thought it was safe, we moved to the other side of the cabin. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. Time seemed to stretch, each second an hour. Finally, the first hint of dawn appeared, painting the gaps in the walls with a pale grey light. As the light grew, we ventured outside. The storm had passed, leaving a world washed clean, but somehow tainted. The trees dripped, the air was cold and sharp. We started walking, not talking, just putting one foot in front of the other, trying to get away from that place. As we continued walking, we passed a tree and saw scratches, as if something had been clawing at it. Then a sound behind us, distant but unmistakable. Footsteps. We began to run. The crunch of leaves echoed under my boots as I walked into the woods. Sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, leaving the trail in a perpetual dimness. Then I noticed them. Small, bright drops against the earthy tones of the path. Blood. My heart jumped. Someone was hurt. I pressed on, the red marks my morbid guide. The drops became more frequent, a disturbing trail laid out before me. Soon they weren't drops anymore, but smears, as if the injured person had stumbled, scraped along the ground. A growing dread began to coil in my stomach. I continued, driven by a sense of grim duty. The smears morphed again. Now bloody handprints marked the trees, as if someone had desperately clawed their way forward. The scene painted a picture of escalating panic, of a desperate struggle. The trail opened into a small clearing, and then nothing. The blood abruptly stopped. The ground was bare, the trees silent witnesses. No body, no footprints leading away, just an unsettling stillness. I scanned the area, my mind racing. Had they been taken? Had they somehow found the strength to carry on? Every theory felt flimsy, inadequate. The silence of the woods pressed in, amplifying the mystery. I circled the clearing, searching for any clue, any indication of what might have happened. But there was nothing, only the blood, ending as suddenly as it had begun. As dusk gathered, I retreated back to my camp. The image of that empty clearing burned into my mind. I ate little, the food tasting like ash. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by fragmented images of blood and desperation. Then I woke. The moon was high, bathing the camp in an eerie glow. I lay for a moment, disoriented, before my eyes landed on it. A single bloody handprint stuck against the canvas of my tent. It was on the outside, pressed firmly as if someone were leaning on it for support. But when I unzipped the tent and looked around, the camp was deserted. Nothing stirred.